The security footage showed 11:47 p.m., a pregnant woman's body hitting marble, then darkness. 6 hours earlier, she smiled for cameras at a charity gala, the perfect wife on a millionaire's arm. No one saw the bruises beneath her dress. No one heard his whispered threats. What happened in that penthouse would expose a monster hiding behind wealth and power. This is the story of Claire Ashford, a woman who survived the impossible and fought back against a system designed to silence her. If this story grips you, hit that like button. Drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear that speaking up matters, and subscribe, because stories like this need to be told. The security camera timestamp read 11:47 p.m. when Claire Ashford's body hit the marble floor. The footage would later show her hand reaching toward her swollen belly in those final conscious seconds, a mother's instinct overriding even survival. But that moment came later. 6 hours earlier, the world still believed in fairness. The Metropolitan Museum Gala sparkled with Manhattan's elite. Claire stood beside her husband, Grant, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. To the photographers, they were magazine cover perfect. Him and Tom Ford, her in emerald silk that disguised 6 months of pregnancy. Flashbulbs burst like stars. Grant leaned close, lips brushing her ear. The cameras captured what looked like an intimate whisper. Only Claire heard the actual words. "Smile wider or you'll regret it when we get home." Her face maintained its careful expression while her stomach twisted. She had learned this skill over 3 years of marriage, the ability to look happy while dying inside. Claire Bennett, once fearless nonprofit director, now Grant Ashford's beautiful accessory. "Mr. Ashford, how does it feel being named Philanthropist of the Year?" a reporter called out. Grant's laugh was warm, practiced. "I'm blessed beyond measure. My beautiful wife, our child on the way, the chance to give back to this incredible city. What more could a man want?" Claire felt his fingers dig into her ribs, hidden beneath the camera's view. A warning. She knew what came next. Her line. "Grant's the most generous man I've ever known," she said softly. The lie tasted like copper in her mouth. 4 hours later, in the back of their private car, the mask began to slip. "You talk too much tonight," Grant muttered, scrolling through his phone. "I saw you laughing with that reporter. What did you tell him?" "Nothing, just pleasantries about the venue." "Don't lie to me, Claire." His voice dropped to that dangerous register she knew too well. "You think I don't notice? You think I'm stupid?" "Grant, please, not tonight. The baby." He looked at her then, and she saw the thing that lived behind his eyes. Not anger, something colder, pleasure at her fear. "The baby," he repeated slowly. "You think that baby gives you power. You think motherhood makes you untouchable." Claire pressed against the car door, her hand instinctively covering her stomach. 6 months ago, she had believed pregnancy would soften him, that becoming a father would resurrect whatever humanity had once existed in Grant Ashford. She had been catastrophically wrong. The penthouse elevator opened directly into their living space. $12 million of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Claire had once thought it beautiful. Now it felt like a glass prison, 40 stories above any possible escape. Grant poured himself scotch. His third of the night, Claire moved toward the bedroom, hoping he would drink himself into sleep. "Where do you think you're going?" She froze. "I'm tired. I thought I'd lie down." "You thought?" He set down his glass with careful precision. "That's your problem. Claire, you think too much. You forget what you are." "Grant, I don't want to fight." "I'm not fighting. I'm educating my wife." He crossed the room slowly, deliberately. "You embarrassed me tonight. Laughing too loud, drawing attention, making people wonder if I can control my own household. That's not fair. I did everything you asked." The slap came so fast she didn't see his hand move. Her head snapped sideways, cheek exploding in heat. She stumbled, catching herself on the sofa. "Fair," Grant's voice remained eerily calm. "You want to discuss fairness? I gave you everything. This home, this life, that ring on your finger. And you repay me by making me look weak in front of the entire city." Claire tasted blood where her teeth had cut her inner lip. The baby kicked, frantic movements against her ribs. She forced herself to breathe, To think, "You're right," she whispered. "The lie of survival. I'm sorry, I'll do better." But even as she spoke the words, something shifted in her mind, a small, desperate thought that had been growing for weeks. "After the baby comes, I'm leaving. I'll take my son and disappear. Grant will never find us." She did not know then how wrong she was, how catastrophically she had underestimated the man standing before her. Grant studied her, reading something in her face. When he smiled, Claire's blood turned to ice. "You're thinking about leaving me, aren't you?" Her silence was answer enough. "Oh, Claire." He shook his head almost sadly. "You really are stupid." What happened next would change everything. Grant grabbed Claire's arm, yanking her upright with such force her shoulder sockets screamed. She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. "Let me go. Please, Grant. The baby. The baby." He shoved her toward the wall. Her back hit the exposed brick, knocking the air from her lungs. "You keep saying that like it matters, like I care about some parasite stealing your attention from me." Claire's mind reeled. This was different from the usual patterns of his anger. Something in him had broken loose, something that had been barely contained before. She saw it in his eyes. Tonight, he might actually kill her. "Grant, you're not thinking clearly. Let's talk in the morning." When his hand closed around her throat. Not squeezing yet, just holding. "I promise, I'm thinking perfectly clearly. You want to leave me, take my child and make me look like a fool, destroy everything I've built." His face was inches from hers now. "But you're forgetting something crucial. Claire, you're mine. That baby is mine. And I don't let go of what belongs to me." She clawed at his hand, gasping. The baby kicked frantically, sensing her terror. "Please," she choked out. "I won't leave. I promise, I'll stay. Just let me breathe." He released her throat but drove his fist into her ribs. Pain exploded through her torso. She doubled over, arms wrapping around her belly protectively. Another blow, this time to her shoulder. She fell, knees hitting marble. "You'll stay because you have nowhere else to go," Grant snarled, standing over her. "Your brother Ben, he's a struggling journalist who can barely pay rent. Your friends, they disappeared the moment you married me. You're alone. Claire, completely alone." She tried to crawl away. His foot caught her in the lower back, sending fresh agony through her body. She screamed, and he laughed. "Go ahead, scream. These walls are soundproof. Nobody can hear you. Nobody's coming." But Grant was wrong about one thing. In the apartment next door, 72-year-old Harriet Wilson was watching late-night television when she heard something. Not a scream exactly. The soundproofing was good but not perfect. A muffled crash, breaking glass. She turned down her TV volume, listening. Another crash, then silence. Harriet had lived in this building for 40 years. She knew the Ashford penthouse had a reputation. Young wife, older powerful husband, always very proper in the elevator. But Harriet had been a social worker before retirement. She recognized the signs. She picked up her phone and dialed 911. Inside the penthouse, Claire tried one more time. "Grant, please, think about what you're doing. You'll go to jail." He crouched down beside her, almost tender now. The mood swing was more terrifying than the violence. "Go to jail." He brushed hair from her bleeding face. "Sweet, naive Claire. I own this city. I own judges, police commissioners, half the district attorney's office. Who do you think they'll believe, the beloved philanthropist whose wife had an unfortunate accident, or a hysterical woman with a history of emotional instability? I don't have a history of—" "You will by tomorrow morning." He stood, smoothing his jacket. "My lawyers have already prepared psychiatric evaluations, medical records showing your depression, your instability. By the time they find you, the narrative will be set." Poor Grant Ashford, devoted husband, whose troubled wife hurt herself in a tragic fall. The cold calculation in his voice was worse than the physical pain. He had planned this, maybe not tonight specifically, but he had prepared for the possibility of needing to destroy her. Claire realized then that she had never truly understood who she had married. This was not a man who lost control. This was a man who controlled everything, including the moments that looked like chaos. She tried to stand. Her legs would not support her weight. Blood trickled down her temple from where her head had struck the wall. "Grant," she whispered. "Our son. He's your child too." For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Then it hardened into stone. "That baby won't save you. Claire, nothing will." He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her across the marble floor toward the kitchen. She screamed, really screamed now, no longer caring about dignity or consequences. Her hands scrabbled for purchase on the slick floor. The baby kicked weakly, as if even in the womb he could sense the danger. Grant slammed her head against the marble countertop. Once, twice. The world exploded into white light and then darkness. The last thing Claire heard before unconsciousness claimed her was the distant sound of sirens. Grant froze, listening. Police sirens, growing louder. Someone had called. Impossible, unless he looked down at Claire's motionless body, blood pooling around her head. For the first time that night, genuine fear crossed his face. Then the mask slammed back into place. He pulled out his phone, already rehearsing the story. "My wife fell. I tried to help her. You have to save her. Please, save my wife." By the time the paramedics broke down the door 3 minutes later, Grant Ashford was cradling his wife's broken body, tears streaming down his face, the picture of a devastated husband. But the security camera in the hallway had captured something else. The sounds that penetrated even soundproof walls. The timeline that would not match his story. Evidence that would disappear within 24 hours. Bought and buried by Grant's money. The game had only just begun. The emergency room at Mount Sinai exploded into controlled chaos when the ambulance arrived. Paramedics shouted vitals while wheeling Claire through automatic doors. 6 months pregnant, massive head trauma, multiple contusions, possible internal bleeding, 2 lives hanging by threads. Dr. Rachel Brennan was finishing a double shift when she heard the name. Claire Bennett. No, Claire Ashford now, her college roommate, the woman who had slowly vanished from all their lives after marrying Grant. Rachel's hands went numb. "I know her," she told the attending. "I need to be on this case." "You're too close. Protocol says she has no family in the city except her brother. Someone who loves her needs to be in that room. Please." The attending saw something in Rachel's face and nodded. The next 4 hours blurred into a nightmare of surgical precision. Rachel worked alongside the trauma team, fighting to stabilize Claire while monitoring the baby's increasingly distressed heartbeat. Every second counted. Every decision could mean life or death for 2 people. "BP dropping," a nurse called out. 70 over 40. "Push another unit. Get the crash cart ready," Rachel commanded, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. She could not think about Claire laughing in their dorm room, Claire dancing at Rachel's graduation, Claire's hopeful face on her wedding day. She could only think about keeping blood flowing, hearts beating, life continuing, fetal distress increasing. "Not yet," Rachel muttered. "Hold on, both of you. Just hold on." In the waiting room, Ben Bennett paced like a caged animal. The call had come at 1 a.m. "Your sister is in critical condition. Mount Sinai Hospital. Come immediately." He had broken every traffic law getting there. Now he could do nothing but wait. Helpless? While strangers fought for Claire's life, a man in an expensive suit approached. Perfect hair, red-rimmed eyes, the picture of concerned husband. "You must be Ben. I'm Grant. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." Ben stared at him. They had met before, twice. Once at the wedding Ben had advised Claire against. Once at a tense Thanksgiving dinner where Grant had dominated every conversation. "What happened?" Ben's voice was flat. Grant's performance was flawless. The trembling hands, the barely contained emotion. "We were talking. She got upset. Emotional. Pregnancy hormones. You know, she stood up too quickly, got dizzy, and fell. Hit her head on the counter. I tried to catch her, but..." His voice broke convincingly. "I should have been faster. This is my fault." Every instinct Ben possessed screamed that this was a lie, but what could he prove Grant Ashford was beloved? Ben was a journalist who had written exactly 3 articles anyone had read. "She fell," Ben repeated slowly. "I've already given my statement to the police. They understand it was a tragic accident." Grant placed a hand on Ben's shoulder. Ben resisted the urge to break it. I've arranged for the best specialist. Money is no object. Whatever Claire needs. Before Ben could respond, Rachel emerged from the surgical wing, still in bloody scrubs. Her eyes found Ben first, then moved to Grant with unconcealed hatred. She's alive, Rachel said. Barely. We've induced a medical coma to reduce brain swelling. The next 48 hours are critical. And the baby, Grant asked, holding on. But if Claire's condition deteriorates, we may have to make difficult choices. Grant nodded solemnly, playing the anguished father. Save them both, please. They're my whole world. Where Rachel's jaw tightened. Can I speak with you privately, Mr. Ashford? They moved to a consultation room. The moment the door closed, Rachel's professional demeanor cracked. I know what you did. Grant's expression did not change. I'm sorry. Claire's injuries aren't consistent with a simple fall, multiple impact points, defensive bruising on her forearms, finger-shaped marks on her throat. This was assault. Dr. Brennan, Grant's voice cooled. I understand you're upset. You and my wife were friends once, but making wild accusations during a crisis helps no one. My wife fell. The police have accepted this, unless you have evidence suggesting otherwise. Rachel wanted to scream that the evidence was written all over Claire's broken body. But she was not naive. She understood how the system worked, especially when money and power were involved. I'll be watching you, she said quietly. Every visitor, every decision about her care. You won't get near her alone. Grant smiled, and for a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Rachel saw the thing underneath. Cold, calculating, utterly devoid of empathy. Of course, doctor, I appreciate your dedication to my wife's care. I'll be making a substantial donation to the hospital in gratitude. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Rachel, that's Dr. Brennan, isn't it? I'll be sure to mention to the hospital board how emotionally involved you are in this case. Probably not appropriate for someone in your position. Might affect your judgment. The threat was clear. Step out of line and lose your career. After he left, Rachel found Ben in the waiting room. Without preamble, she said, he beat her. This wasn't an accident. I know. Ben's hands clenched into fist. But how do we prove it? They stared at each other. Two people who loved Claire, both utterly powerless against the machine of Grant Ashford's influence. In her hospital bed, Claire lay motionless. Machines breathed for her. Monitors tracked the fragile heartbeat of her unborn son. And somewhere in the darkness of her comatose mind, she fought to survive, because survival was the only revenge available to the powerless. Outside the hospital, Grant Ashford stood in the parking garage, making calls to his lawyers, to police contacts, to the private investigator who specialized in making problems disappear. By sunrise, the narrative would be set. The security footage would vanish. Any witnesses would reconsider their statements. The tragic accident of poor Claire Ashford would be sealed in official record. Grant had won before the game even started, or so he believed. 72 hours after Claire's admission, Ben sat in his cramped studio apartment, surrounded by printouts and notes. Sleep had become a memory. Coffee and rage sustained him now. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Mr. Bennett, my name is Detective Troy Winters. I'm with the Major Case Squad. I'd like to discuss your sister's case. Ben's pulse quickened. The police ruled it an accident. Officially, yes. Off the record, I've been a cop for 20 years. I know the difference between a fall and a beating. Winters paused. Can we meet somewhere private? They arranged to meet at a diner in Queens, far from Manhattan's watchful eyes. Winters was exactly what Ben had hoped for. Grizzled, cynical, tired of watching rich men buy their way out of consequences. I can't promise anything, Winters said over terrible coffee. Ashford has half the department in his pocket. But if we build an airtight case, even his money can't stop an arrest. What do you need, Mont? Evidence, witnesses, anything concrete that proves this was assault? Winters leaned forward. Does your sister keep a diary? Emails documenting the abuse photos? Ben shook his head. Grant controlled everything, her phone, her computer, her schedule. She was isolated. Then we need to find someone close to him, someone who saw his real face. Winters pulled out a folder. I've been looking into Ashford's background. 3 previous girlfriends before your sister. All broke up with him suddenly. All signed ironclad NDAs. That's not normal. Can we talk to them? They're terrified, but one of them, a woman named Vanessa Cole, she's still in the city, works as a model. If anyone might talk, it's her. Over the next week, Ben threw himself into investigation. He tracked down Claire's old friends, people she had stopped seeing after marrying Grant. The picture they painted was consistent. Claire had slowly withdrawn, always with excuses. Too busy. Grant needs me. Maybe next time. Classic isolation tactics. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Rachel maintained her vigil. Claire remained in the coma, stable but not improving. The baby's heartbeat stayed steady, a small miracle. Grant visited daily, playing the devoted husband for the nurses. He brought flowers, read aloud from Claire's favorite books, even shed tears when he thought people were watching. But Rachel noticed things. The way his jaw tightened when doctors mentioned Claire's potential recovery. How he asked, repeatedly, about her chances of waking with memory intact. The phone calls he took in the hallway, his voice dropping to angry whispers. One night, Rachel was reviewing Claire's charts when a woman approached the ICU desk. Mid-20s, expensive clothes, nervous energy. I'm here to see Claire Ashford. Family only. The woman hesitated. I'm a friend. Please, I need to see her. Something in her desperation moved Rachel. Give me your name. I'll ask her brother. Vanessa Cole. Rachel's eyes widened. She had heard that name. Grant's previous girlfriend. The one Detective Winters wanted to interview. Wait here. 20 minutes later, Vanessa sat in a private consultation room with Rachel and Ben. Her hands shook as she spoke. I dated Grant for 2 years. At first, he was perfect, charming, generous, attentive. Then small things changed. He didn't like my friends, wanted me available whenever he called, got angry if I wore certain clothes. She looked up, eyes haunted. Then came the first time he hit me. Did you report it? Ben asked gently. I tried, went to the police station. The officer took my statement, seemed sympathetic. Next day, Grant's lawyer showed up at my apartment with papers. They had evidence that I'd been unstable. Fake psychiatric records, doctored emails, photos that made me look erratic. They said if I pursued charges, they'd destroy my career and credibility. I signed the NDA and left town for 6 months. Rachel felt sick. He manufactured evidence. He has people who specialize in it, lawyers, investigators, even doctors willing to falsify records. That's what terrifies me about Claire waking up. If she testifies against him, he'll do to her what he threatened to do to me. Except she can't leave. She's carrying his child. Then we need to move first, Ben said, before he can set up his defenses. Vanessa reached into her purse, pulled out a USB drive. I kept copies. Everything they threatened me with, showing it was fabricated. Dates that don't match. Metadata proving the documents were created recently. Not years ago. It's not much, but it proves his pattern. For the first time in days, Ben felt something like hope. But hope is dangerous when your enemy owns the game. The next morning, Ben's apartment was broken into, his laptop stolen, the printouts he'd made, the notes, Claire's few possessions he had saved all gone. The USB drive Vanessa had given him, also missing, taken from his supposedly secure hiding spot. The message was clear. We're watching. We know everything you do. When Ben called Detective Winters, the cop's voice was strained. I need to step back from this case. What? Why? My captain received a complaint, anonymous, claiming I was harassing Grant Ashford, pursuing a vendetta. There's going to be an internal investigation. If I keep pushing, I'll lose my badge. Winters sounded genuinely pained. I'm sorry, kid. This is bigger than both of us. Ben hung up and stared at the wall of his ransacked apartment. Grant had just demonstrated the full extent of his power. He could reach anywhere, corrupt anyone, erase any evidence. The system was not broken. For men like Grant Ashford, it was working exactly as designed. Ben sat in the ruins of his apartment, surrounded by emptiness where evidence had been. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Mr. Bennett, this is Lauren Hayes. I'm an attorney specializing in domestic violence cases. I'd like to help your sister. How did you get my number? Dr. Brennan gave it to me. I've been following Claire's case. I know what really happened. They met that afternoon in Lauren's office. She was younger than Ben expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I'll be direct, Lauren said. Grant Ashford is a monster, but he's a careful monster. We need to be more careful. I'm offering pro bono representation for Claire when she wakes up. If she wakes up, the words tasted like ash. She will, and when she does, she'll need protection. Legal, physical, financial. Grant will try to take everything, including custody of the baby. Over the next hour, Lauren outlined a strategy. Document everything, build a network of witnesses, find patterns in Grant's past that establish predatory behavior. There's something else, Lauren said carefully. I have a contact, someone who might testify against Grant. Who? A former employee, a housekeeper who worked for the Ashfords. She saw things, bruises Claire tried to hide, arguments she overheard. She's scared, but with the right protection, she might talk. So for the first time in days, Ben felt the possibility of winning, not just surviving, but actually defeating Grant. That night, Vanessa met with Ben and Rachel at a 24-hour diner in Brooklyn. She slid a new USB drive across the table. I made copies of the copies, kept them in 3 different locations. They can't steal them all. This is dangerous for you, Rachel said. If Grant finds out you're helping us, he already knows. I got a message today, anonymous text with a photo of my disabled sister in her group home. The implication was clear. Vanessa's voice hardened. But I'm done being scared. If I don't stop him now, he'll do to Claire what he did to me. Except worse, because she can't escape with his child. They were building an army, small, underfunded, outgunned but determined. The problem with armies is that enemies learn their composition. 2 days later, Lauren called Ben. Her voice was different, tight, scared. I can't help you anymore. Now I would wipe. Grant's people contacted me. They know about my sister. She's disabled, lives in a care facility. They said one phone call and her funding disappears. She'd end up as a state institution. Lauren's voice cracked. I'm sorry, and I can't risk her life for this case. Another door slammed shut. That same day, the housekeeper who Lauren had mentioned, she recanted her entire statement, claimed she had been confused, never saw anything unusual. Grant and Claire had seemed happy together. Ben knew what had happened, money or threats, probably both. He was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, trying to process these setbacks, when a woman sat down across from him, late 50s, silver hair, judicial bearing. Mr. Bennett, I'm Judge Margaret Sullivan. I handle family court cases. I wanted to speak with you about your sister's situation. Ben's guard went up immediately. I don't think that's appropriate while she's incapacitated. Perhaps not. But I wanted you to know I'll be overseeing any custody decisions regarding the child. She paused. I've known Grant Ashford for many years. He's contributed significantly to several charitable causes I support. I just want to assure you that the baby will be well cared for. The message was clear. The judge was already in Grant's pocket. My sister isn't dead, Ben said quietly. And when she wakes up, she's keeping her son. Judge Sullivan smiled sadly. Of course, I'm just ensuring all possibilities are considered for the child's welfare. After she left, Ben put his head in his hands. They were not just fighting Grant. They were fighting an entire system that protected wealth and power. His phone buzzed. Text from Rachel. Claire's vitals are improving. She might wake up soon. Hope and terror in equal measure. If Claire woke up, she could testify, but she would also be vulnerable. A conscious target Grant could threaten, manipulate, or worse. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the judge's words. The child's welfare. What if Grant tried to take the baby the moment he was born? What if Claire woke up only to lose her son around 3 a.m.? His phone rang. Unknown number again. Stop investigating. The voice was electronically distorted. Stop talking to witnesses. Stop building a case, or your sister will have an unfortunate complication. Medical errors happen in hospitals every day. The line went dead. Ben called Rachel immediately. We need security on Claire's room, now. Already done. After the judge's visit, I requisitioned private security. Hospital administration approved it. Surprisingly, let me guess. Grant donated money for it. $100,000. Enough to get his people placed as her guards. They were surrounded, every move anticipated, every defense compromised before it could be erected. Ben looked out his window at the sleeping city. Somewhere out there, Grant Ashford was probably sleeping peacefully, confident in his invincibility. But Ben had learned something in his years as a journalist. The more powerful someone was, the more they had to hide. And eventually, everyone made a mistake. He just needed Grant to make one mistake. Just one. Then he would burn the man's entire world to the ground. On the 12th day of her coma, Claire's eyes opened. Rachel was there when it happened, reviewing charts at her bedside. Claire's hand twitched first. Then her eyelids fluttered. Consciousness returning like a tide. Claire, can you hear me? A small nod. Confusion in her eyes. Rachel hit the call button while gripping Claire's hand. You're safe. You're in the hospital. You've been in a medically induced coma. Do you remember what happened? Claire's lips moved. No sound came out. Her hand drifted to her stomach, panic flaring in her eyes when she felt the swell still there. The baby's okay, Rachel said quickly. He's strong, fighting just like his mother. Tears slipped down Claire's face. Not relief. Something darker. Fear. Over the next hours, specialists ran tests. Claire's cognitive function was intact. No apparent brain damage beyond some expected memory fog. A miracle, given the severity of her injuries. Ben arrived within minutes of Rachel's call. When he saw his sister awake, he broke down completely. They held each other, neither speaking, both understanding that this was only the beginning of the real fight. When the doctors finally left them alone, Claire whispered, He'll kill me now. He knows I can talk. We won't let him near you, Ben said. You don't understand. He owns this city. The police, the judges, the hospitals. There's nowhere he can't reach. Her hand tightened on Ben's. You need to promise me something. If something happens to me, you take my son. Don't let Grant have him. Promise. Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me. Ben? He promised, knowing it was a promise he might not be able to keep. Grant arrived an hour later with flowers and tears. An Oscar-worthy performance. Thank God, he breathed. Reaching for Claire's hand, she flinched away. His expression flickered anger, then hurt, settling on concern. Darling, it's me. You're confused. The doctor said there might be some disorientation. I remember everything. Claire's voice was stronger now. You beat me. You tried to kill our baby. Claire, no. You fell. You were upset. You got dizzy. I remember your hands around my throat. Your fists. You said the baby wouldn't save me. Grant's mask slipped for just a second. Ben saw it. Rachel saw it. But there were no cameras in the room. No witnesses beyond people Grant could discredit. I would never hurt you, Grant said softly. I love you. You're the mother of my child. Whatever you think you remember, it's the trauma talking. The doctors warned me about this. Memory distortion after head injury. He was good. Ben had to give him that. Calm, reasonable, concerned. The perfect husband worried about his wife's mental state. Get out, Claire said. I don't want you near me. I understand you're upset, but I'm your husband and I have rights. We need to think about what's best for our son. Our son, Claire's laugh was bitter. You beat his mother unconscious. You're not fit to be anyone's father. Grant's expression hardened. I'll give you time to recover. We can discuss this when you're thinking more clearly. He turned to Ben. I'd like to speak with you, privately. In the hallway, Grant's friendly mask evaporated. Your sister is unstable. The doctors will confirm it. Pregnancy hormones, head trauma, emotional volatility. I'm filing for emergency custody of the child upon birth. Judge Sullivan will hear the case. You can't take her baby. Watch me. I have medical experts prepared to testify about Claire's mental state. I have evidence of her erratic behavior, and I have unlimited resources to ensure my son grows up in a stable environment. Grant stepped closer. You want to fight me? Go ahead. I'll destroy you. Then I'll destroy her. And when that baby is born, he'll be mine. Claire will be lucky if she gets supervised visitation. He walked away, leaving Ben shaking with helpless rage. Back in the room, Claire was talking to Rachel. I need to tell the police. Make a statement. Press charges. I'll call Detective Winters, Rachel said. But when she tried, Winters' captain informed her the detective had been suspended pending investigation. No one else would take her call seriously. That night, a new attorney arrived. Marcus Flynn, civil rights lawyer with an impressive track record. Pro bono, he said, heard about the case, wanted to help. We can beat him, Marcus assured them. I've taken down powerful men before. Money doesn't buy innocence. For 48 hours, Ben allowed himself to hope. Marcus was everything they needed. Sharp, experienced, fearless. He filed motions, gathered statements, prepared for the custody fight. Then Marcus called a meeting. His face told them everything before he spoke. I'm withdrawing from the case. What? Why pause? Grant's team found something, a DUI from 10 years ago that I thought was sealed. They're threatening to expose it. Claim I have a pattern of recklessness. It'll destroy my credibility. Marcus looked genuinely pained. I'm sorry, I can't help you. Another ally lost. Another door closed. That night at Duin, Claire went into premature labor, stress-induced. The baby was coming, whether anyone was ready or not. And Grant Ashford was waiting in the hallway with legal documents that would tear mother and child apart the moment of birth. Claire's son was born at dawn on a Tuesday, 6 pounds, 2 ounces, perfect in every way that mattered. They named him Henry, after Claire's father. She held him for exactly 17 minutes before Grant's lawyers arrived with court orders. Emergency custody hearing is scheduled for this afternoon, the lead attorney announced. The child will remain in hospital custody until Judge Sullivan makes her determination. Rachel tried to intervene. The mother just gave birth. This is unconscionable. The mother is mentally unstable with a documented history of emotional volatility. We're protecting the child's welfare. They took Henry from Claire's arms. Her screams echoed through the maternity ward as Ben held her back from attacking the lawyer. Security was called. It took 3 people to restrain her. My baby, she sobbed. Please, not my baby. But the law had spoken. And the law, in this case, were Grant Ashford's fingerprints. The custody hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. Marcus had withdrawn, leaving them without representation. Ben made frantic calls, but every attorney in the city knew Grant's reputation. No one would touch the case. At 1:30, the paralegal arrived with documents. Ben read them in growing horror. Medical records showing Claire had been treated for depression 3 years ago. Psychiatric evaluations diagnosing her with emotional instability. Witness statements from former friends claiming she had violent outbursts. All of it fabricated, but the documentation looked official. Dates, signatures, medical letterhead. Grant had spent the weeks of Claire's coma building an alternative history. How do we fight this? Ben asked Rachel. I don't know. Without a lawyer, without time to refute these documents. They lost before they entered the courtroom. Judge Sullivan presided with an expression of sympathetic professionalism. Grant sat at the plaintiff's table, the picture of concerned fatherhood. Claire, still weak from childbirth, sat with Ben, no legal representation. Grant's attorney presented their case methodically. The psychiatric records, the witness statements, the expert testimony from a doctor who had never met Claire, claiming she was a danger to herself and the child. When Claire tried to speak, to defend herself, Judge Sullivan cut her off. Mrs. Ashford, I understand this is emotional for you, but without proper legal representation, I cannot allow you to make statements that might prejudice these proceedings. He beat me, Claire said anyway. He put me in a coma. Those records are fake. Mrs. Ashford, please. The judge's voice was stern. These are serious accusations requiring serious evidence. Do you have proof these documents are falsified? They had lost the USB drives in the apartment break-in. Vanessa had recanted. Every witness had been bought or threatened into silence. I have the truth, Claire said desperately. The truth as you remember it, but your medical records show significant head trauma. Memory distortion is common in such cases. Judge Sullivan looked genuinely sympathetic, which made it worse. I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashford. But based on the evidence presented, I'm granting temporary custody to the father pending further evaluation. The gavel fell, the sound of Claire's world ending. Grant was allowed to hold his son, to take him from the hospital, to install him in the penthouse where he had beaten Claire unconscious. Claire collapsed on the courthouse steps, photographers capturing her breakdown for tomorrow's headlines. Unstable mother loses custody. Devoted father protects newborn son. That night, in her empty hospital room, Claire asked Ben for sleeping pills. The way she asked made his blood run cold. Promise me you're not thinking about hurting yourself. I'm thinking that Grant was right. He wins. He always wins. And now he has my son. We'll keep fighting. We'll find a way. There is no way. You saw what happened. He controls everything. The judges, the doctors, the narrative. What can we possibly do against that? Ben had no answer. For the first time, he wondered if Grant truly was untouchable. Later, Ben sat in his car outside Grant's building, watching lights in the penthouse. His hand rested on the gun in his glove compartment. One bullet. That's all it would take. One bullet and Grant Ashford would never hurt anyone again. He sat there for 3 hours, finger on the trigger, imagining it. The satisfaction of watching Grant fall. The justice that courts could not provide. But then what prison? Leaving Claire truly alone. Henry growing up knowing his uncle murdered his father. Ben drove away, the gun unused. But the thought remained. Sometimes the law fails. Sometimes the system protects monsters. What then? What do you do when justice is impossible? Ben sat in his car at 4 a.m., staring at nothing. The gun was heavy in his hand. He had driven back to Grant's building, parked in the shadows across the street. One shot, ended all. A tap on his window nearly made him pull the trigger. Vanessa Cole stood there, urgent and terrified. Don't do it. Please, I have something better. She slid into the passenger seat, pulled out a phone. I've been recording him for months, ever since I heard about Claire. You recanted your statement. You said, I said what his lawyers told me to say, but I kept recording. She pressed play. Grant's voice filled the car, clear, unmistakable. Coaching the doctors on Claire's psyche, Val. Make sure it looks legitimate. I don't care what it costs. That baby is mine, and she'll never see him again. More clips. Grant discussing how to falsify medical records, bragging about owning Judge Sullivan, laughing about Claire's breakdown on the courthouse steps. The beating, that wasn't about control. That was about breaking her completely. Making sure even if she survived, she'd never dare testify. The final recording was timestamped 2 days ago. Grant talking to his head of security. If Claire doesn't back down, we'll need a permanent solution. Make it look like suicide, postpartum depression. Everyone will believe it. Ben stared at the phone. This is everything. Why didn't you give this to the police before? Because I was terrified. I still am. But tonight I saw the news. Claire on those courthouse steps. And I realized that if I don't stop him now, he'll kill her. Then he'll move on to the next woman. And the next. Vanessa's hands shook. I can't live with that. We need to get this to someone Grant doesn't own. Media, FBI, someone beyond his reach. I already made copies, sent them to 3 different journalists, civil rights attorneys, a federal prosecutor I found who specializes in corruption cases. She smiled grimly. They all get the files at 6 a.m., 2 hours from now. Grant will wake up to his entire world burning. Ben looked at the gun in his hand, then back at the phone. Vengeance versus justice. Murder versus exposure. He put the gun away. At 5:30 a.m., they sat in an all-night diner, drinking bad coffee, waiting. Ben called Rachel. Get Claire somewhere safe, away from the hospital, now. When these recordings go public, Grant will be desperate. Rachel moved fast. She checked Claire out against medical advice, took her to a women's shelter that specialized in hiding domestic violence survivors. By the time Grant's people realized she was gone, Claire had vanished into a network designed specifically to protect women from powerful men. At 6 a.m., the first article dropped. New York Times. Real estate mogul caught on tape discussing evidence fabrication. Threats. By 6:30, it was everywhere. CNN, MSNBC, local news. The recordings played on loop. Grant's voice, his casual cruelty, his calculated destruction of his wife. By 7 a.m., the prosecutor's office had no choice. Public pressure demanded action. Arrest warrants were issued. Ben watched it unfold from the diner. Vanessa beside him. The viral spread of truth. Twitter erupted. And our justice for Claire trended worldwide. People who had never heard of Grant Ashford now knew him as a monster. At 7:45 a.m., police arrived at Grant's penthouse. He opened the door in silk pajamas, clearly having just woken. For a moment, he was confused. Then he saw the cameras, the news crews that had gathered, the crowd of protesters who had materialized seemingly from nowhere. Grant Ashford, you're under arrest for assault, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and corruption. This is ridiculous. I'll have my lawyers. Your lawyers can meet you at booking. You have the right to remain silent. The cameras captured everything. Grant in handcuffs. Grant being led to a police car. Grant's face when he realized his money could not save him this time. The public had turned. And when the public turns, even bought judges get nervous. Judge Sullivan recused herself that afternoon, citing potential conflicts of interest. An investigation into her relationship with Grant was launched immediately. Detective Winters was reinstated, placed in charge of building the criminal case. Lauren Hayes called Ben. I'm back on the case. My sister's care facility received an anonymous donation, enough to guarantee her safety for the next 10 years. Someone's looking out for us. They later learned it was Vanessa, using money she had saved for years. Insurance against the day she might need to run from Grant. But the biggest change was Claire herself. When Ben brought her the news, she didn't cry or celebrate. She just asked one question. Can I see my son? Emergency custody was reversed. Henry was returned to his mother's arms. This time, no one tried to take him away, but the story was far from over. Grant's arrest was just the beginning. Now came the trial, the real test of whether truth could actually defeat power. And Grant Ashford, even from a jail cell, still had cards to play. The trial began 6 weeks later. By then, the media circus had reached fever pitch. Cameras surrounded the courthouse. Protesters held signs reading, "Believe survivors and justice for Claire." This was no longer just about one woman. It had become a referendum on power, privilege, and accountability. Grant had assembled a legal dream team, 5 attorneys, each more expensive than the last. Their strategy was clear attack, Claire's credibility, claim the recordings were taken out of context, paint him as a devoted father victimized by a vindictive ex-wife. But they had not counted on Claire's strength. She took the stand on the 3rd day. Henry now safe with Rachel in an undisclosed location. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke. I met Grant Ashford 5 years ago. He seemed perfect. Charming, successful, attentive. Within 6 months, we were married. Within 8 months, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. She detailed everything. The first slap, the isolation from friends, the escalating violence, the night he beat her unconscious while she begged him to spare their unborn child. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled as she described the marble countertop, the blood, the certainty that she was dying. Grant's attorneys tried to shake her. They brought up the fabricated psychiatric records. They suggested she was an unreliable narrator, traumatized and confused. Mrs. Ashford, isn't it true you have a history of depression? No, that history was manufactured by your client. But these medical records are fake, as the metadata analysis will show, as Dr. Brennan's testimony will confirm, as the original hospital records prove. Claire met the attorney's eyes without flinching. Your client spent weeks creating a false history for me. But the truth has a way of surviving lies. Rachel had spent weeks gathering evidence to refute every falsified document. Bank records showing payments to the doctors who had signed fake evaluations. Emails proving the records were created weeks, not years, ago. Digital forensics revealing altered timestamps and fabricated signatures. The prosecution played the recordings. Grant's voice filled the courtroom, admitting to fabricating evidence, discussing how to silence witnesses, laughing about destroying Claire's life. That baby won't save her. I'll make sure she never sees him again. The jury's faces said everything. Disgust, anger, recognition that they were witnessing calculated cruelty. not a crime of passion. But Grant's team had one final card. They called Vanessa as a hostile witness, trying to discredit the recordings. Isn't it true you have a personal vendetta against Mr. Ashford, that you're a scorned ex-girlfriend seeking revenge? Vanessa met their eyes steadily. I'm a survivor, just like Claire. Just like the two women before me who were too scared to come forward. I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking justice. She paused, letting the words settle. And I'm making sure he never hurts another woman the way he hurt us. Then the prosecution revealed something no one had expected. Two other women, former partners of Grant's who had been found through the investigation. Both had signed NDAs. Both had been paid to disappear. Both had lived in fear for years. Now they testified. Same pattern, charm, isolation, violence, threats, cover-up. One woman showed scars on her arms from where Grant had grabbed her. Another described being pushed downstairs, then threatened with lawsuits if she told anyone. Grant Ashford was not a man who lost control once. He was a predator with a system, a pattern spanning nearly a decade. The defense tried to argue that these women were coordinating their stories, seeking financial gain. But the similarities were too precise, too consistent. These were not fabrications. They were testimonies of survival. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Expert witnesses testified about domestic violence patterns. Forensic accountants traced Grant's payments to cover up previous incidents. Detective Winters outlined how evidence had been systematically destroyed or hidden. By the end, Grant's defense had crumbled. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern undeniable. The jury saw not a respected philanthropist, but a man who had weaponized his wealth against vulnerable women. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the forewoman's voice was clear and certain. On the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. On the charges of witness tampering, evidence fabrication, and corruption, guilty. Marie-Claire sat motionless as the verdicts were read. No tears, no celebration, just quiet vindication. Ben squeezed her hand. Rachel sat behind them, crying silently. Grant's face went ashen. For the first time, genuine fear crossed his features. The mask he had worn for so long finally shattered completely. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge was new, a woman with no connection to Grant, no tolerance for abuse of power. Mr. Ashford, you used your wealth and influence to brutalize multiple women, corrupt the justice system, and attempt to steal a child from his mother. You showed no remorse, only calculation. The court sentences you to 40 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 20. 40 years. Grant would be 78 when he got out, if he survived that long. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked at Claire one final time. She held his gaze, unflinching. The woman he had tried to break was still standing, stronger than ever, unbroken. Outside the courthouse, Claire gave her only statement to the press. This isn't just my victory. It's for every woman who has been told she's powerless, every survivor who has been silenced, every person who thought the system would never protect them. Today, we prove that truth matters, that courage matters, that speaking up, even when it seems impossible, can change everything. The crowd erupted in applause. But that night, alone in her apartment with Henry sleeping in his crib, Claire finally let herself cry. Not from sadness, from release. The weight she had carried for years, fear, shame, helplessness, finally lifting. She had survived. More than that, she had won. 1 year later, Claire stood in a small art gallery in Brooklyn. Her paintings covered the walls bold, raw expressions of pain transformed into beauty. Each piece told a story. Survival, resilience. The journey from victim to survivor to victor. Critics called her work visceral and unflinching. Survivors called it healing. Claire called it necessary. The only way she knew to process everything that had happened. Henry toddled around her legs, happy and healthy, 18 months old now, with Claire's eyes and a smile that belonged only to himself. He would never remember the nightmare of his first weeks. That was the greatest mercy. He would grow up knowing only safety, only love. Rachel arrived with champagne. Your opening is sold out. Every piece has multiple buyers fighting over them. You could name any price. I'm not sure I'm ready to sell them yet, Claire admitted, studying a painting of hands breaking free from chains. They feel like parts of myself, pieces of my soul I put on canvas to keep from carrying them inside anymore. Then keep them. You don't need the money anymore. Rachel touched Claire's shoulder gently. You've built something beautiful from something terrible. That's power Grant could never understand. While Grant's assets had been seized and liquidated, Claire had filed a civil suit and won a substantial settlement, millions of dollars that represented not compensation. Nothing could compensate for what she had lost but acknowledgement. The system admitting it had failed her, then trying to make amends. But money was not what mattered most. Security mattered. Freedom mattered. The knowledge that Henry would grow up safe. Ben approached with Vanessa, who now worked as an advocate for domestic violence survivors. She had turned her trauma into purpose, helping other women escape situations like the one she had endured. How does it feel? Vanessa asked Claire, being on the other side of survival. Strange, some days I still look over my shoulder, still expect him to appear, even though I know he's locked away. Claire smiled sadly. The trauma therapist says it's normal. PTSD doesn't disappear overnight. Some days are harder than others. But it gets better. It gets manageable. The nightmares come less frequently. The panic attacks are fewer. And some days, I almost forget to be afraid. Those are the good days. Claire looked at Henry, who was showing Rachel a toy truck. And watching him grow up happy, that makes every hard day worth it. Detective Winters had visited last week, bringing news. 3 more women had come forward with accusations against Grant from years past. The DA was building additional cases, even from prison. Grant's past was catching up with him. His sentence might extend even longer. He might never leave prison, Winters had said. And honestly, the other inmates don't take kindly to men who hurt pregnant women. Word spreads fast in there. He's having a very rough time. Claire had felt nothing at those words. Not satisfaction, not sympathy, just emptiness where Grant used to live in her mind. The absence of feeling was itself a victory. He no longer had power over her emotions. That was real freedom. Judge Sullivan had been disbarred after investigation revealed years of accepting bribes and favors from wealthy defendants. Detective Winters had been promoted to lieutenant, now heading a special task force on domestic violence cases. Lauren Hayes was now specializing in cases against powerful abusers, using Claire's case as a blueprint for how to fight back. Change was happening. Slowly, imperfectly, but happening. The system was learning, adapting, becoming slightly less willing to protect wealthy predators. At the gallery, strangers approached Claire all evening. Some shared their own stories of survival. Some thanked her for being brave enough to fight publicly. Some just needed to see that escape was possible, that victory was achievable. One young woman lingered near a painting titled Breaking Point, a figure rising from shattered glass. She was nervous, trembling. My boyfriend, he's a lot like what you described. Charming in public, cruel in private. I keep thinking I should leave, but he's convinced you that you can't, that you're nothing without him, that no one will believe you. Claire took her hand gently. You can leave, and people will believe you. It won't be easy. The system is still broken in many ways, but it's possible. The woman's eyes filled with tears. How did you find the strength? I didn't find it. I built it, day by day, moment by moment. And I didn't do it alone. I had my brother, my friend, an unlikely ally who became a hero. Claire squeezed her hand. Find your people, build your support network, document everything quietly and safely. And when you're ready, run. Don't look back. She pressed a card into the woman's hand. Vanessa's number. The domestic violence hotline. Resources that had not existed for Claire when she needed them, but existed now. The woman clutched the card like a lifeline and disappeared into the crowd. Later, when the gallery had emptied and Henry slept peacefully in his stroller, Claire stood before her largest painting. It depicted a woman rising from flames, not victorious but surviving, burned but unbroken, scarred but standing. Ben joined her, studying the artwork. Mom would be proud. Dad too. I wish they'd lived to meet Henry, to see me on the other side of this nightmare. They're seeing it. I'm absolutely sure of that. Ben put his arm around his sister's shoulders. You did what seemed impossible. You survived, you fought and you won. They stood in companionable silence. Two siblings who had survived a war together and emerged stronger. Do you ever regret it? Ben asked quietly. Fighting instead of running. The trial was brutal. The publicity, the exposure, reliving everything in front of cameras. Every day. And never. Claire turned to him, her expression thoughtful. Fighting almost destroyed me. The nightmares, the anxiety, the constant fear during those weeks. But running would have destroyed who I am. Some battles you can't walk away from and still recognize yourself in the mirror, even when the odds are impossible. Especially then, because someone has to show that impossible just means difficult, not unbeatable. Claire looked at her son, sleeping peacefully. I fought so Henry would grow up knowing his mother was strong, knowing that bad things happen but good people fight back, knowing that speaking up matters. As they left the gallery, Claire paused at the door. For just a moment, she let herself remember the woman she had been before Grant, the woman who believed in fairness and love and happy endings. That woman who thought people in power would do the right thing. That woman was gone. She had died in the penthouse that night, her hope beaten out of her on marble floors. But someone new had been born in her place. Harder, wiser, stronger. Someone who had looked at power and refused to blink. Someone who had survived when survival seemed impossible. Someone who knew that justice was not given freely, it had to be fought for, bled for, demanded. Claire looked at her son, sleeping peacefully in her arms. He would grow up knowing his mother was a survivor, knowing that bad things happened, but good people fought back, knowing that truth mattered, courage mattered, speaking up mattered even when your voice shook. These were the lessons Grant Ashford had inadvertently taught. In trying to break her completely, he had forged something unbreakable. The night air was cool on her face as they walked to the car. Somewhere in the city, the system was still broken. Powerful men still hurt vulnerable women. Justice still favored the wealthy more often than not. But tonight, one survivor had won. One abuser had faced real consequences. One voice had spoken loud enough to echo through courtrooms and headlines and the hearts of other survivors who needed to know that fighting back was possible. It was not everything. The work was far from finished. But it was something. And sometimes, something is enough to change the world. Or at least, to change one woman's world. And through her, to give hope to countless others still trapped in their own nightmares. Claire strapped Henry into his car seat, kissed his forehead, and drove toward home. Not the penthouse prison where she had nearly died, but a modest apartment filled with light, laughter, and love. A place where she chose every detail, where every decision was hers. Freedom, she had learned, was not about wealth or status. It was about autonomy, choice, the ability to say no and be heard. She had that now, and she would never let anyone take it away again.